Thank you so much, Judge Williams, for that very kind introduction. So the other day, I was catching up with a friend that I hadn't spoken with in a long time, and I was telling her about this case that I'd been working on for about 13 years, and how excited I was that there was relief on the horizon for this client. And my friend turned to me and she asked, how do you work on a case for 13 years? How do you not become despondent? And I thought about it and I explained, I'm perpetually looking for the next opportunity on the horizon, and he never gave up on me, so how could I give up on him? And I was searching for how to explain something that did sound pretty nuts now that I was saying it out loud. And I thought about it and I said, well, I'm a weeble wobble. And she said, a what? I said, a weeble wobble. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. For those of you who are unfamiliar, a weeble wobble is a toy from my childhood. They were egg-shaped and made to look like people. I think they were weighted on the bottom. And the trick is, you could push a weeble wobble, and they would rock back and forth, but you couldn't knock it down, and you couldn't knock it over. So I guess I'm a weeble wobble. Not your typical lawyer trope. I'm not a superhero swooping in to rescue people in dramatic fashion. I'm not a pit bull. Definitely not a magician. I'm a weeble wobble. I hang in, and I chip away, and I keep coming back. I'm dogged. I know how to believe in outcomes that I haven't seen, as do my clients. Now, I'm here today because my mom believed in me. My mom has a 5th grade education in her country. She eventually earned her GED here. She cleaned houses when I was a kid, amongst other jobs. And if I told my mom that someday I was gonna play in the NBA, now mind you, I'm 5 feet tall, I'm not very coordinated, my mom would have been plotting on how she was gonna get the money to buy me a pair of Jordans. And I didn't understand the magnitude of that gift when I was a child, her boundless faith in me. I had some challenging circumstances growing up, and I remember the frustration of not having the power to change my circumstances at the time. It's what made me want to be an attorney. I have wanted to be an attorney since I was a child because I wanted to help people who were not in a position to help themselves. My desire to liberate myself from what was at times a difficult childhood informed my desire to help others. I was a first-generation college and law student. I didn't know any lawyers growing up. I definitely didn't know any lawyers who looked like me. But I believed in what I couldn't see yet. It's also why I love birds. If you come to my home or my office, you'll see pictures of birds and bird figurines. In my yard, you'll find bird feeders. And I love them for a simple reason. They seem free to me. Every time I go to visit a client in prison, I look for the birds. Because the idea that something can fly up and over those walls and fences whenever it wants gives me hope. The idea that something can move away from what it knows and towards something that it can't see yet gives me hope. In order to transform our criminal legal system and our society, which are inextricably linked, we have to have the courage and the vision to believe in something that we cannot see yet, that something different is possible, and that the unfamiliar and the uncomfortable are part of the path. 9,344,000 days. 9,344,000 days, 25,600 years lost. As of 2021, exonerees, according to the National Registry of Exonerations, served a collective 9,344,000 days. Men and women who were innocent of the crimes of which they were convicted. Now, right here in Maryland, according to the registry, just as of last week, as a matter of fact, there have been 42 exonerations since 1989, and those exonerees served a collective 221,555 days, 607 years. Now take a moment to reflect on the enormity of that loss. My clients, they talk to me about aging parents and aging children. They talk about missed birthdays and funerals, the cornerstones of our lives, births and deaths. They talk about growing old themselves. Now, while I was working from home during the pandemic, I spoke with a client, and I happened to mention the rain pouring outside my window and how my dog was sitting in a chair in my office, staring outside, looking at the rain. And he remarked, the client, not my dog, he remarked, "Wow, this is a normal conversation." Millions of mundane, normal conversations missed. Now keep in mind, an exoneration is a very particular kind of thing. It requires working against a system that is designed to preserve convictions. Our criminal legal system worships at the altar of finality. By the time someone has been convicted and sentenced, the burden is on them to prove that something went wrong with the trial. The law presumes that the jury got it right, and the opportunities to challenge that verdict are few and far between. Even for the innocent, it is like threading the eye of a needle while riding a bus driven over a street filled with potholes. The odds are certainly against you. It typically requires evidence such as recanting witnesses, DNA that remains to be tested, forensic science that is now debunked, lawyers, experts. It takes an army of resources and years of litigation to get to an exoneration. On average, it takes about 7.5 years. And if a defendant's case doesn't have evidence that can show it wasn't them, maybe they were convicted without any forensic evidence, maybe they were convicted based on one person's mistakes or lies, their innocence may never be known. Every week, letters pour into our clinic and to innocence projects around the country begging for assistance. The exonerees are simply the ones that the public eventually knows about. The exonerees are miracles. To give you a very recent example, the Maryland Court of Appeals recently disbarred State's Attorney for Harford County, Joseph Casserly, for his conduct in the case of Mr. John Huffington. Mr. Huffington was charged with a double homicide in 1981, and the court found, amongst other things, that Mr. Casserly knowingly and intentionally failed to disclose for more than a decade exculpatory evidence that tended to show that the defendant was not guilty, that came to light after the defendant's conviction, that Casserly discarded evidence. He sought to have forensic evidence in the case destroyed, and that he knowingly made false statements to the court and defense counsel about the content of that evidence. After serving 32 years and challenging his case through years of litigation, twice winning a new trial, Mr. Huffington pleaded guilty and received a time-served sentence. Mr. Huffington is not on the list of exonerations. Mr. Huffington's 11,680 days is not accounted for in that 9 million total. When reached for comment, Mr. Casserly stated, "Do I care? I don't give a damn. I wouldn't do anything to engage in the practice of law right now because it is such a screwed up obscenity." Mr. Casserly was elected state's attorney, the highest ranked prosecutor in Harford County for nearly 40 years. He is one of only 5 prosecutors in the United States who have been disbarred for this kind of conduct. The number of exonerations on record so far, 2,884, let us know that Mr. Casserly's conduct is not an aberration. 5 bad actors don't give us 2,884 wrongful convictions. So when we talk about justice in this context, what does that mean? Is Casserly's disbarment justice? Is it a measure of justice? Achieving justice for Mr. Huffington seems impossible to me because we cannot restore Mr. Huffington's 32 lost years. We cannot undo that atrocity. Exonerating the innocent is what is morally required of us, but a just system would not permit such a thing to occur. Mr. Casserly is only a symptom of the problem. Many years ago, I represented a client who was sentenced to life in prison for felony murder in the 70s. In fact, he received his life sentence on my very first birthday. He and I laughed about that. His future lawyer turned one on the day that he was given a life sentence. Now, he was serving a sentence at a time in Maryland where he could get paroled from the particular prison where he was. And he earned parole, but he remained on lifetime supervision. He spent about 25 years building his life, earning success in a leadership position at his job, owning his own home, happily married, raising a daughter who was on the honor roll and on her way to college. He also cared for his elderly mother who lived with him. The years wore on and the stress of lifetime supervision weighed on him. He would sit in the dark after his parole meetings, depressed and withdrawn. He was in his 50s and life was good, but those meetings with parole always reminded him that he was forever a criminal, no matter what he accomplished. And his freedom was not his and could be taken away at any time. One day at an office party, someone passed him a joint and he smoked. Later, he tested positive for marijuana. Law enforcement came to his home at 2 a.m. and terrified his family. They took him back to prison, where they reimposed his life sentence. A 50-something-year-old black man that was, in all senses of the word, rehabilitated. He served 2 more years before we were able to get him out through a drug treatment program. His health declined during those 2 years, and he ultimately needed dialysis and a kidney transplant. He made it out, he survived, he reached back to help other incarcerated men. The grace, courage, and compassion he showed, both while he was incarcerated and after his release, was a testament to his extraordinary character. Anyone who knew him would have been lucky to know him. But getting him out was not justice. His never having been returned to prison would have been closer to justice. Today actually would have been his 69th birthday, and his daughter, a graduate of the University of Maryland at College Park, is watching tonight. I recently was rereading Roxane Gay's New York Times article, "No One is Coming to Save Us from Trump's Racism," about Trump's remarks referring to Haiti, El Salvador, and African countries as shithole countries. She writes, quote, "This is a painful, uncomfortable moment. Instead of trying to get past this moment, we should sit with it. Wrap ourselves in the sorrow, distress, and humiliation of it." That advice applies equally here, that we all must sit with the horrors of our criminal legal system, some of which occur through horrific misconduct, some of which are a product of both individual and systemic racism, some of which occur through vast disparities in resources, some of which occur through callous indifference to the lives of those who are buried alive behind the walls. Before there is a way forward, we must witness and acknowledge the sorrow, distress, and humiliation of it. In 1972, fewer than 350,000 people were being held in prisons and jails nationwide, compared with more than 2 million people today, a 500% increase over the past 40 years, fueled in part by the so-called war on drugs and tough on crime policies. These facts are from the Sentencing Project. They are also referenced in a book we should all be reading, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. These increases are not experienced equally across races. Black men are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men, and Latinx men are 1.3 times as likely. Right here, in our own backyard, in our blue state of Maryland, we have the dubious distinction of incarcerating a greater proportion of our Black citizens than any other state in the nation. 30% of our population is Black, 70% of our prison population is Black. 87% of our juvenile lifers are Black. Women, particularly women of color, are also experiencing this trend. Between 2008 and 2020, there was a 43% increase in women serving life without parole sentences. Nationally, 1 in every 39 incarcerated Black women is serving a life without parole sentence, as compared to 1 in 59 incarcerated white women. Women serving life sentences report high levels of psychiatric disorders, histories of being victims of physical and sexual violence, and previous suicide attempts. So where do we go from here? The title of this talk is taken from a quote from someone I greatly admire, Bryan Stevenson, the author of another book we should all be reading, Just Mercy. He is a career criminal defense attorney and the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. He says that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. That belief informs my work. And I think it applies not just to those that we might label criminal or convict, it applies to all of us. It applies to our legal system and our society. If we are to change, we must believe that we are capable of more than the worst of our criminal legal system. That our story, because it is our story, doesn't end with 9,344,000 stolen days. Something else is possible. That our story doesn't end with our state caging a greater proportion of its Black citizens than any other state in the nation. And there are reasons to be hopeful and reasons to keep fighting. We've made many positive gains in the legislature, and we'll have more to come, I hope, this session. This last session, we saw the passage of the Walter Lomax Act, named after exoneree, activist, and my friend, Walter Lomax. I first met Walter in prison, but he wasn't incarcerated. We were both there to talk to lifers about their rights. I already knew his story, so when I met him, I thought, my God, the courage and generosity to set foot in a prison after what had been done to him. The Walter Lomax Act provides for compensation for the exonerated. It provides a specific amount, formula, and timeline for payment. Prior to the passage of the act, exonerees spent years fighting to receive the compensation they needed and deserved. Another change that I'm so thrilled to see happening in Maryland is the Juvenile Restoration Act. Similar legislation is happening in states around the country. This law eliminates life without parole sentences for children in Maryland. This law also permits individuals in Maryland who are children at the time of the crime, who have served at least 20 years, to go back to court and demonstrate that they are rehabilitated. They can request a reduction in sentence. Under this bill, 412 men and women who are serving life or life equivalent sentences may ask for a second chance. This law passed with the support of a broad coalition of formerly incarcerated individuals, crime victims, activists, and local and national organizations and legislators. As we begin to look at the impact of this legislation in other states, we can see that the recidivism rate, the instances where a person released commits another crime, of this population is less than 1%. We also have our legislative work cut out for us. Maryland is one of 3 states in our nation that requires the governor's approval to parole someone who's serving a parole-eligible life sentence. In 1995, then Governor Paris Glendening made his infamous life means life pronouncement. He stopped granting parole to anyone serving a life sentence, even those who pleaded guilty to avoid life without parole sentences in exchange for the possibility of someday earning parole. Now, in all fairness and in recognition that we are all more than our worst mistakes, our mistakes and our bad decisions, Paris Glendening has recently publicly expressed his regret for that policy. The policy continued up until Governor Hogan, who did begin paroling some lifers, though they were precious few. After decades of effort by activists and organizations, the bill to remove the governor from the parole system in Maryland finally passed last session. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed the bill, but I am hopeful the veto will be overridden in a special legislative session on December 6th. There's also work to be done to re-enfranchise our formerly incarcerated citizens. Did you know that in Maryland, if you have a criminal conviction and you've served more than a year, felony or misdemeanor, you can never serve on a jury. You are permanently disqualified. When you are aware of the racial breakdown in our prisons and jails, it becomes clear what portion of our population is being disenfranchised. Last session, legislation was proposed to change juror disqualification in Maryland, and I hope to see that legislation pass this session. There's also important juvenile justice reforms up this session as well. Maryland charges more children in adult court than any other state other than Alabama. One of the juvenile justice reform bills would end the automatic charging of kids in adult courts. I hope to see that and other juvenile justice reform efforts pass this session. I'm also encouraged by prosecutors' offices who believe that their mandate to do justice requires that they devote resources to reviewing the cases of the wrongfully convicted and the overly incarcerated. Many of the exonerations I've talked about today were made possible with the collaboration of conviction integrity units. Specialized units within prosecutors' offices are popping up around the country, often staffed by former defense attorneys. The mission of these units is to re-examine old cases and identify the innocent. Just last week in Baltimore City, David Morse was exonerated after serving 17 years. His exoneration came through the collaboration of the UB Innocence Project Clinic, the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, and the Conviction Integrity Unit of the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office. Prior to the passage of the JRA, I worked on the case of one juvenile lifer for 8 years. He was incarcerated when he was 16 years old and given a life sentence in 1994 when parole was still a possibility. His sentencing judge spoke about his expectation that someday he'd be paroled, but he never was. Glendenning's policy changed a year later and sealed his fate. Somehow, despite his circumstances, he maintained positivity and hope. Despite receiving a life sentence, what became a death in prison sentence after the governor's shift in policy, this client never gave up hope and never stopped fighting for himself. Ultimately, we convinced a judge to reduce his sentence, and he was released when he was 40 years old. He sends me a text every year on our Freedomversary, and he sends me pictures of his son. His resilience astounds and inspires me. The wrongfully convicted who continue to fight for themselves, who believe that something different is possible, that they might triumph against all the forces that have rallied against them to bury them alive, astound and inspire me. Men and women who've been thrown away as children, sentenced to death in prison sentences, who don't give up, who help others, earn degrees, continue to work on themselves despite being told that they are done. They believe in something more than what they can see. They believe that something different is possible for them. And I would invite you to do the same, to have the courage and curiosity and vision to know that something different is possible and that every single one of us has a role to play in that change. Local politics matter. Pay attention to your elected officials. Support those whose values align with your own. Call them up. Tell them how you think they should vote. Listen and amplify the voices and stories of those who are or have been incarcerated. Support organizations such as the Judge Alexander Williams Center and others who work to address disparities in justice. Continue to educate yourselves about our criminal legal system and its impact on our communities. My students, the next generation of lawyers who are filled with hope and zeal and compassion, inspire me. And those students are gaining another opportunity to learn about, interact with, and impact the criminal legal system with UB's new Center for Criminal Justice Reform, which was established through a generous donation from alumnus Sam Rose. This center will support community-driven efforts to improve the criminal legal system and will bring together UB students, faculty, members of the community, and decision makers to examine how the criminal legal system currently functions and to collaborate and propose reforms that will reduce systemic inequality and promote justice. I am grateful to the Maryland Office of the Public Defender and the University of Baltimore School of Law for the privilege of my position, for their belief in the mission and their investment in the Innocence Project Clinic. My clinic is fortunate to be an affiliate of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, which connects us with the broader network of innocence organizations around the country. I'm so grateful to the Judge Alexander Williams Center for its commitment to justice and for shining a light on the clinic and supporting us in our work. My mission as the director of the Innocence Project Clinic is to identify and to work to exonerate the innocent. That is my job. But I came to this work with experience working with the wrongfully convicted and the overly incarcerated. My humanity and the humanity of my clients require that my personal mission is broader. Those that we know to be innocent now were once considered the guilty and the condemned, and there are so many more that we don't know about yet. But also understand that those that we have condemned are more than the act for which we have condemned them. I'd remind you that some of my most satisfying victories have been accomplished by inches, over time, continuing to hang in and looking for the next opportunity. I'm not encouraging you to be patient, but I am encouraging you to be dogged, to be relentless, to be a weeble wobble. I encourage you to believe in things that your eyes haven't seen yet. I invite you to reject false binaries, justice or mercy, criminal or victim, us or them. Our fates are bound up with each other. I'll leave you with 3 of the most important things I've learned from this work. First, we cannot incarcerate our way to safety or wholeness. Second, compassion is not a finite resource or a zero-sum game. Showing compassion for the incarcerated does not diminish your capacity to care about and support victims of crime. Investing in resources to help our returning citizens transition benefits us all, as does investing resources in our communities to address the root of these disparities. Last, I'll remind you of the birds. There is risk in reaching out toward what we cannot yet see, but there is faith in the gamble, and there is value in the reach and the attempt. That client that I told you about in the beginning, whose case I worked on for 13 years, he was resentenced after serving 32 years. I lost his case over and over and over again, till one day I didn't. The tide shifted. The path ahead toward a more just and equitable society is not a straight line. It will inevitably involve joyous victories and painful defeats. But to quote Angela Davis, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. Thank you.